There is a lot of content in Shrader-Frachette's text that we've read, and one of the things that she does is run through a number of objections that people make to environmental justice, to the idea of environmental justice, or to particular advocacy around environmental justice, and she tries to counter those objections, that is, to reply to the objections and say why she's not convinced by them. I'm actually not going to go into that in this set of lectures, but I want to briefly mention her sort of conclusions or her proposal for what to do about environmental injustice issues in the form of a set of principles that she articulates, which are the standard for environmental justice. And I think this is worth noting because we want ideally to have, if we're convinced by the idea of environmental justice and that it's a good thing to strive for, then it would be good to have some kind of guideline as to what we're looking for to try to achieve, or what are the marks of environmental injustice, though I mentioned some of that to you before. But what would count as a solution to environmental injustice problems? And that's part of what she's articulating here with these principles. However, I think it's worth noting that there's some significant difficulty in articulating in an uncontroversial way what would count as a condition of full environmental justice. And and also some controversy about what kinds of policies or procedures would actually get us closest to that condition. So this comes up particularly, I mean, on this slide there are again the two different kinds of justice noted, participative and distributive, and I'll talk through the content of these principles in just a moment. But the economic equality part of distributive justice is likely to be extremely controversial because it's a very controversial issue. What would count as an equitable distribution of resources? What's the ideal kind of policy as far as economic distribution and redistribution is concerned, as I think you're all quite familiar with from arguments on the news and so on. So insofar as Shrader-Frachette hasn't exactly given definitive guidelines on economic equality, and she sort of leaves the answer to this question of what counts as economic equality rather open-ended, one might suspect that the project of trying to achieve environmental justice by her standards hasn't been given really fully specific guidelines by these principles. So the first of these principles is that people should be treated equally under the law. That's political equality. That is, the same laws should apply to everyone. The second is that people should be treated equally in the distribution of wealth. And there are a number of ways that this can happen. It can be an equality of opportunity, or it can be an equality of the precise goods that are distributed to people. And again, this is a fairly controversial kind of ambition. It's not entirely clear what the ambition should be or how one should try to bring it about. It's much more controversial than political equality, for instance. And one of the interesting points that Shrader-Frachette makes along these lines with both of these is that there are some just inequalities. That is, it's not that Shrader-Frachette wants to argue that humans ought to be completely equal in all respects, that all humans ought to have exactly the same property, for instance, or have exactly the same role in society. She wants to recognize that there can and should be differences sometimes between people. So equality in these senses is not identity, or it's not full sameness in all characteristics. However, there's a question about what kinds of inequality are justified and which ones are not. And what she wants to say about that is that violations of equality ought to be thought of as things that need explicit justification rather than the reverse. It shouldn't be that we look out at society and see lots of inequality and we accept that as just the way things are. And then when someone comes along and says we ought to make this more equal, then we ask that person for arguments and we say, well, tell us why that should be equal. Rather, what we ought to do is assume that everything ought to be equal. And then when things are unequal, we ask, what's the reason for that? So what she's trying to do is shift what's sometimes called the burden of proof from the person who accepts inequality and asks for justification for equality. She's trying to shift the burden of proof in the other direction so that we expect equality, we assume equality, and then when we see inequality, we ask what's the justification for it. And in some cases, it may be justified. So why can some people legally practice surgery whereas others can't? Because those who can legally practice surgery have advanced medical degrees, right? Why do people with advanced medical degrees make more money than those who don't have advanced medical degrees, or at least in some, across some comparisons? To some extent, you might say it's justified because there's a cost of education for people who have advanced medical degrees, and that cost has to be offset with their salaries to repay student loans and things like that. So there may be justifications for various kinds of inequality in the role that people have in society, in the resources that they have, income and things like that. But in every case, we need a justification for it rather than simply assuming it as just, well, that's just whatever happened and that's okay. So I think that's a very productive and interesting proposal that Shrader-Frachette is making on that point. And the last kind of equality that she talks about here is participative equality. And here she's particularly concerned to argue against the assumption that only experts or primarily experts should make decisions about environmental policy and other environmental matters. What she wants to argue for is that communities affected, individuals and communities affected by some environmental policy, or that have some other kind of stake in how some environmental resource is used or distributed. These are what are sometimes just called stakeholders, which is a broad word for any person that has some stands to gain or lose from what's done about some resource, some policy matter, or some environmental policy matter. That stakeholders ought to have, ideally, an equal say in what happens. They ought to be able to cast their votes alongside experts in terms of what happens with any environmental resource or policy proposal. And part of her reason for saying that is that even though experts often think of themselves as particularly unbiased, there's a lot of evidence that they are biased in a lot of ways, and they often don't recognize, say, aspects of their policies that would negatively affect certain stakeholders. And whereas stakeholders would recognize that and be able to articulate it and be able to, cast their votes in accordance with it. Yeah, so that's basically her argument there about participative justice.